And we're going to speak about regenerative farming and related questions of sustainability. So Andy, tell us, what got you interested in regenerative farming?
Well, as you alluded to, I spent most of my life doing something quite different until 16 years ago. I was coming back from a gig and I read an article about the environmental costs of food production. It was a very inspiring article, and it had a line in it which said, if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that sort of made me think about trying to grow vegetables. I'd never planted a seed in my life at this point. And from the moment that I saw a seed become a plant and the plant become food, one, I was hooked. Two, I thought, why isn't this the first thing that we study at school? And three, it set me off down a road which I'll be on for the rest of my life, and which culminated in selling the publishing rights to the songs I'd written to finance the purchase of a farm and try and do this at scale.
Was that first attempt a success?
No.
So tell us about that.
Well, I mean, looking back on it now, when I went from the vegetable patch to a farm, I did so with hopeless naivety, and it was a very, very humbling lesson in just how difficult farming is, how lonely it is, and how you're making huge decisions day in, day out in the context of a business where you have no control of your input prices. You have no idea how much you're going to produce, particularly in a world of wild weather, and you have no idea how much you could sell it for. I mean, can you imagine a worse business model than that?
Right. Yes. Maybe journalism, I guess. But we'll leave that aside. You believe that there are some myths around agriculture that you'd like to take on. Before we get to those, can you tell us, just for those in the audience that are not planting themselves or following agriculture so closely, how do you define regenerative farming in your approach?
Well, it's a very good question. Something maybe we'll come on to later is the fact that what I'm now doing, which is a field-to-plate supply chain under the name of Wildfarmed, we have defined the Wildfarmed standards because regenerative risks becoming like natural or healthy. Anyone can use it and lots of people are.
Right.
And we have to make absolutely sure that this pivotal moment of existential importance doesn't get greenwashed away. But in the words of the person who first came up with the term in the 80s, which was an American called Rodale of the Rodale Institute, it's simply a way of growing food in a way which, as the name suggests, makes things better rather than making them worse. It regenerates landscapes.
Now, that's a very generic, although inspiring way to think about it. I mean, what is the connection with, say, pesticide use or chemicals or soil sequestration of carbon? I mean, are there some specific attributes that are important to you when you think about regenerative farming?
There are. I think it's really important to understand the context of all this. And if we go back to the end of the Second World War, and the sort of the peace was over the peace was this sort of shadow of this existential problem number two, which was the fact that the population was predicted to increase from about 3 billion to 8 billion.
Right.
And there was a sort of Malthusian risk of famine. And so in that context, what became known as the Green Revolution and amazing work by the Iowan botanist Norman Borlaug, who invented these crop varieties, which together with pesticides and fertilizers had this transformational impact on yield. And because pesticides and fertilizers are retooled explosive and chemical weapons factories, there was no shortage of those in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And so we had this exponential increase in food production. But I think there's two really important things to remember is that one, it was applied to agricultural soils which were in a really bad state by then already. And it created all this abundance by bypassing these natural systems, hence its reliance on all these inputs. So one of the things that we think of today in a regenerative context is we can often think, we take all the chemicals away, but we're not going to have enough food. But actually we've got the technology and the science and the information today to build a farming system which harnesses natural systems. And when Europeans arrived in America, the grass was so tall, on horseback they couldn't see where they were going. So let's not underestimate the abundance of nature if we can harness it.
So in a sense, you want to return to a prior way of doing farming. Is that fair to say? Or you want to combine that with new technologies or new tools?
Yeah, I don't think it's by no means a retrospective looking thing. A lot of the soil scientists...
You're not a Luddite.
But we're not going to get anywhere by doing that, and it overlooks the fact that we've been worried about maintaining fertility of soils for a very long time. When the Romans sacked Carthage, the only book that they kept was the farming guide from the Phoenicians, and so this has been a problem that we haven't really solved very well.
They took a lot of salt with them too, as it's called. Yeah.
They did. And today we've got what we need to solve that. And there's some fascinating soil and plant science which allows us to work with rather than against nature.
So just to put a fine point on this and to maybe push back a little bit, I had the great pleasure of meeting Norman Borlaug. I opened our Mexico City bureau for The Economist, and when he was working at the Agricultural Center that's based there, part of the UN system of agriculture, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Green Revolution, which ultimately is credited with saving 1 billion or more lives, many of them in India, South Asia, other places where the population was booming, but food was not able to keep up, partly because of degraded soils. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the agricultural revolution that took place, but you're pointing out the legacy of that revolution. And from your perspective, what did it either get wrong or what have we learned not to do?
I think we're living
the results are undeniable. I mean, the population continues to flourish. There's no genuine famine. I think the economist Amartya Sen has shown there's been no famine around in world history that has been resulting from lack of actual food. They're typically political interventions, wars, and other systemic interventions, not the inability to produce food. That is true today. What's the problem with that system?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right to point out there is no Darth Vader villain in the room here. We're living out unforeseen consequences of what was good work at the time. But the unforeseen consequences are dramatic. I mean, we don't want to start reeling off sort of endless depressing statistics, because this is a hopeful story because we can solve this problem. And we're working with businesses and farmers who are doing just that, and as are other people around the world. But, in my lifetime, the decline in nature, if we put it in the terms of the human population, is the same as losing everyone in Europe, North and South America, China and Australasia. Or the fact that here in the UK, we're spending more just on diet-related diabetes than our entire legal budget, prisons, judges, so on. It's an utterly unaffordable way of feeding ourselves. We have to change that.
The approach you're taking, now you're focused on wheat and bread, am I right? Can you tell us a little about what you personally are doing in this area?
Yeah, so the culmination of the dark days at the French farm, eventually through experiments too long-winded to repeat here, but ended up growing cereals in fields which bring nature and food together. And I think one of the things that we need to just get away from is this idea that in a given area there's a choice between nature and food, that one can exist without the other. And there are specific funding issues around that, which that creates as well. But I ended up with this farming system where those two things were combined, and we had a local mill and bread shop on the farm, and people came and bought their food. And the legacy of that was that people are directly able to use their food choices to contribute towards, one, their health, and two, environmental outcomes. So the starting point for Wildfarmed with my co-founders was, how do we do this at scale?
Right.
And so today we're working with over 100 farmers and micro bakers, M&S, Ask Pizza, Franco Manca, all kinds of people. But the key to unlocking all of that is that there's lots of choices on the high street today with your food, but knowing who grew it isn't one of them. And for us, the key was building a new supply chain that goes from field to plate, because as soon as you do that...
With transparency, with traceability.
With traceability, and everyone who's supporting the farmers knows what the farmers are doing, hence defining the Wild Farm standards. So we could say, this is what's happening here. And it means that all the way along that supply chain, the people who are benefiting from the value, so the clean rivers or the biodiversity uplift and so on, can all contribute. And that means that farmers can get paid fairly.
Right.
But we avoid a situation where we hike food prices, because when we've got more food banks than McDonald's, that's not socially reasonable.
Well, I want to talk about the economics of this, but I want to let my audience know I'm going to come to you for a couple of questions for Andy, so please collect your thoughts and have our microphone runners ready to go. On the question of economics, you touched on cost. Presumably there are some additional costs involved in doing things the way you advocate. How do you overcome the notion that this might be however wonderful it is, this could be just something for the elites, that this is an affectation, like initially organic food or locavore food. These are trends that, the wealthy types who could indulge in this could afford, but for the ordinary man and woman, it may be too expensive. How do you overcome that challenge?
I think there's two aspects to that. The first one is that we often assume that we can, in quotes, feed the world, which is another thing we should probably talk about, but we can feed the world with business as usual. We can't. We need to disabuse ourselves of that notion, because there will be no food in non-functional ecosystems in a non-functional climate, full stop. So let's just put that one to one side.
No, that's not even taking on board the climate change argument. This is just the way agriculture is done you think is unsustainable.
Well, let me give you just one concrete example. So that I moved back from France as part of the Wildfarmed project. I'm now a tenant of the National Trust. I've been on this farm for about 3 years. We've had another year of absolutely wild weather. Farming in non-predictable weather is of existential difficulty.
Yeah.
So yesterday I was walking back along an uncultivated field margin, so it's never been touched. It's been driven on and walked on, it's been abused a bit, but it's never been cultivated. After all of this rain, the grass is green and there's no surface water. Right next to it, on the field that's been cultivated for however long it's been cultivated for, there's standing water and insipid pale grass. Now, if the field was the same as the margin, every football pitch would hold 500,000 litres more water. Now, we can't live in the world that we're moving into now unless we sort that out. So the first thing, to go back to your question, was we have to be honest about that business as usual is no longer fit for purpose. The second bit of the question is we have to redefine cost, because the UN estimates that for every £1 of value in the UK food system, there are £2 of costs that aren't on the spreadsheet. We've got to get those costs on the spreadsheet, but we have to share them. And what we can't do is impose that burden on farmers, because farmers are forced into a wafer-thin margin business.
Right.
And you say to them, we're going to keep this whole extractive food system the same, and it's down to you to sort this out. Well, what happens is manured town halls and burning tyres all over Europe, and it's the only possible response. That was in response to a 30% reduction in pesticides over the next 10 years. Our farmers are farming without any pesticides at all, but they're choosing to do that because we've changed the system rather than imposing system change.
So a question from the floor that came in on the Slido talks to this. Farming tends to be a low margin business and risky business as well, given the weather. If you don't want consumers to pay more and farmers don't pay more, but you acknowledge there are systemic costs, but also systemic benefits, how do we find a mechanism for paying for those other benefits?
Yeah, well,
who should pay?
This is a question that we dedicate our entire existence to at Wildfarmed, to solving it. And there isn't a silver bullet here. It's lots of different pieces. So, for example, the way that our farmers grow means that there aren't nitrates or pesticides in the river. And so we're working with the first water boards now who are paying the farmers directly, because it's much cheaper to keep that stuff out of the water than it is to take it out of the water. There's the whole area of reduction in CO2 emissions before you even get into sequestration, which is a thornier one to measure. Just in the fact of massively reducing nitrogen fertilizer use, there's an enormous reduction in CO2. So there's a whole carbon piece. So
there can be some revenue streams for the farmers from these environmental goods or social goods that they provide.
Exactly, and the government has to lead on that. So we're having very, very constructive conversations with DEFRA at the moment, and I shan't leave them alone until they're concluded. But they have to. There has to be a recognition that farming systems that bring nature and food together are such existential importance for our society. They have to be rewarded.
Great. Good. I promised to come to the audience. Let's see. I think I saw, let's go on this side here, since I favored the center last time. A question. Again, please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Jim McClelland of Sysmeme, and I'd just like to ask, we've seen attempts to label the carbon footprint of foods, but as you suggested, perhaps, what about the water footprint, especially for the likes of avocados? So.
Okay, very specific guacamole-related question, but I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, well, I honestly can't comment on the specifics of avocado farming, and I think that in a UK setting, our hope is that from all of these conversations that we're having around biodiversity, around carbon and water quality and use, and it's very important that we don't just focus on the upsides, that we focus on the avoidance of harm. Because when a farmer switches from one system to another, it's not just there's going to be more bees and insects and cleaner water, it's that what would have happened hasn't happened. So there's two sets of values that we need to unlock there. And what we're trying to bring all this together is as an environmental token that can sit on people's balance sheets by being tradable. Because as soon as it can sit on people's balance sheets, if you've paid me £400 rather than £300 for all of these services, but the £100 different is actually for all the things we're talking about, and that's an asset, then you've actually only paid £300 for the product. And that, to me, if we can get there, we're already in this huge collaboration, as I say, from M&S to micro bakers and all these restaurants and all these farmers.
Right.
If we sort that piece out, there is nothing that we stopping us from this being the mainstream alternative. There's nothing that we don't know that we need to know for this way of producing food to happen tomorrow.
Well, a tradable environmental token sounds very interesting if it can be systematized. I see a question over there near the camera. If we can have that. Again, please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Eric Grace. I come from ESSEC School of Management. And my question wants to redirect the conversation maybe a little bit towards developing economies, because I come from Mexico City, as was mentioned, especially. And I want to focus on the fact that there in Mexico, we have a measurement of poverty that covers 7 different things. One of them is access to quality food and diet. And at the same time, unfortunately, we're the country with the highest child obesity rate, and 46% of people are under the poverty line. So how can regenerative agriculture help in ensuring that food and better diets are provided to those in need without affecting their income, not the farmers' one necessarily?
Thank you.
I think we have to sort of divide this question into two, and we're dealing with one aspect of this, which is how our food is grown, and the second thing is what happens to it after it goes into the food chain, and unpicking all of this is highly complex. One of the unforeseen consequences of the Green Revolution was this vast increase in production, as you said. Today, we're producing enough food for 10 calories, important difference actually, for 10 billion people. So we've got a distribution problem. We haven't got a nutritional quality problem. It isn't in itself a production problem.
Right.
We've got, in a sort of plot twist that you could, in a work of fiction, would have been disregarded as implausible, we've got 40 million acres using fossil fuel-based agrochemicals to produce crops which become biofuels. We've got 30% of the world's food being grown and never eaten, or 63% of European grains being fed to animals. We don't need to tweak these excesses very much to get to a point where we can live off nature's interest rather than cashing in its capital. But one of the consequences of these endless supplies of cheap raw materials has been an open invitation to use those raw ingredients in processing and create all the foods that are creating all the issues that was being referred to then. Now, we as Wildfarmed, we're trying to make sure that our landscapes recover and that we can leave a resilient food supply for the next generation. We can't also deal with the whole food processing question, but part of all this is literacy about our food and where it comes from and what the difference is between feeding ourselves and nourishing ourselves, and reconstructing these supply chains in a way where that last processing step doesn't create a world where it's far more attractive to sell ready meals than peppers. But we, as Wildfarmed, we can't take the whole of the responsibility for that.
Yeah. I might have time for one last question if there's a hand. Let's go on this side, please. We'll see someone there. Again, please make it a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Cynthia Tapera. I'm from Pivot Africa. I work with smallholder miners in Africa. I come from Zimbabwe. My question is rather on the conflict that I see between mining and agriculture. In Africa, we see mining happening where mostly agriculture happens. And in my country, there is a conflict with policy. So if I find gold or a mineral on your farm, then the act supersedes the Agricultural Act. So we are trying to feed the millions and billions, and at the same time, we are also trying to extract minerals for the transition. So how do we balance? What's the balancing act here? How do we coexist under the same space? Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, I'm in no position to comment on the specific issues of where you are, but I think in general, it resonates with me because I think as a society, and I include myself in this until 16 years ago, we're completely divorced from our food supply, and we assume that it's just going to be there, and it's not just going to be there. And so I think that there's a sort of an all-encompassing issue here whereby there needs to be a recognition that we're part of these natural systems, that we can't divorce ourselves from these natural systems, and the unforeseen consequences that we're living through today are what happens when we try. And I think the notion that I think is still held on by some in certain businesses and the government, that we can just defer our food production abroad, even if it's being produced at huge ecological and human cost elsewhere, but it will always be there somewhere and we can always buy it. And that's always been the case for now. This is not happening anymore. And that in the climate that we live in today, we have to build a resilient food supply, and that can only start with healthy soil. There's no technology that can get around that.
I think that's a good note to end on, to not take the system for granted, to be so blithe about it, but really to think about how to reinvent agriculture. Andy, Cato, thank you very much.
Thank you.